Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon who, in conjunction with his father, destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612, and who conquered Judah and took the Hebrews, many of them anyway, into the so-called Babylonian captivity. The state he established was short-lived, however, as we'll see, like so many in Mesopotamia. And in 539, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Palestine, for which reason he is regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament, even though he was not a Jew. The Persian Empire of Cyrus was to stretch from Persia in the east to the Mediterranean, and this brought about friction with the Greeks, and we'll backtrack to hear about them. Minos is the fellow after whom the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete in the second millennium is named, and this usually is considered to be the first civilization of the Greek world. It was probably put an end to by invaders from the mainland, and the most important early Greek city there was Mycenae, the home in Greek tradition of Atreus and his son Agamemnon. These fellows have question marks after their names because they are more mythological than historical, but the places where they are said to have lived are real enough, and we'll see what Arthur Evans found on Crete and Heinrich Schliemann found at Mycenae, and that'll prepare us for the Trojan War, which we'll get to the next time. This is a modern artist's eye view of what Babylon more or less looked like at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, who helped his father wreck the Assyrian capital at Nineveh in 612, as we heard last time. Babylon had been a great city in the days of Hammurabi, after whose death it was sacked by the Hittites and pretty much disappeared from history, as did most of Mesopotamia for several hundred years. During the Assyrian hegemony, it had again become important and was to reach its peak of power and influence now after Nineveh was reduced to a smoking ruin. Babylon was to become, in fact, the largest city of the ancient world before Rome, and certainly one of the most impressive, with things like its hanging gardens, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the Tower of Babel in the background here. This is all the remains of the famous ziggurat, or Tower of Babel as it's called today. Originally, it was apparently around 270 feet high, and it was by far the largest such thing in Mesopotamia. Oddly enough, the fact that it was built mostly with kiln-dried rather than air-dried bricks probably contributed to its destruction. These bricks were very durable and could be taken away and used for things like sheep pens, which came to be thought more important than ziggurats after Babylon too had gone the way of Nineveh. As late as the 1950s, an archaeologist reported going into something like a 7-Eleven on the road between Baghdad and Babylon and seeing bricks from the Tower of Babel in its wall inscribed, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the universe, built this." That's the sort of thing that might puzzle future archaeologists. It's also been suggested that it might have, at least in part, burned down. Tar was used as mortar and may have caught fire in some way so that the thing just kind of smoldered away like a pile of old rubber tires. Herodotus claims he saw a wall 50 miles long around the city, but not even Rome was to have a wall that long. It may be, however, that there were some outer defense works or something like that around the city of that extent. Here you can see part of the processional way, the Champs-Élysées of ancient Babylon, reconstructed in situ, but a large part of the original glazed tile decoration is now in Berlin. In about 1900, Robert Koldewey and his German colleagues began their work here, and eventually brought some 30,000 fragments of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way back home, where they sorted them out and then reconstructed large parts of these things in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. If you ever think about becoming an archaeologist, keep this picture in mind. Archaeology is the only blue-collar job which requires an advanced degree. Here you can see some of the results of their efforts in the reconstruction of the processional way leading to the Ishtar Gate. The lion is the symbol of Ishtar, who was, though this is an oversimplification, the goddess of love and war. In 610, Nebuchadnezzar forced King Josiah of Judah into an alliance that committed the Hebrews to fight on unequal terms against Egypt, and they were defeated and Josiah was killed at Megiddo. Nebuchadnezzar himself then defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, but that did the Hebrews, who had basically just been used as cannon fodder, no good at all. Judah was basically in the position of a third world country between two superpowers, and not in a position at this point to control its destiny. Here you can see the Ishtar Gate itself. The decoration of it and of the processional way is made of glazed tile, which the Babylonians were the first to use on such a large scale. This is said not to be a true arch with a keystone, but it is nevertheless one of the earliest surviving uses of an arch of any kind. The Egyptians and the Greeks of the classic period didn't use it at all. The Romans, who made it one of the hallmarks of their architecture, apparently got the idea for it from the Etruscans, who might have gotten it from the East, but that kind of diffusionist thinking is highly speculative. In 598, Jehoiakim, who had succeeded Josiah as king of Judah, refused to go farther with Nebuchadnezzar's New World Order and made an alliance with Egypt against Babylon despite the warnings of the prophet Jeremiah. The Babylonians then sacked the city, and the Hebrews themselves apparently killed Jehoiakim for bringing this trouble on them. He was replaced by Zedekiah, whom the Babylonians thought would be more tractable. In 587, however, he also revolted against Babylon. Hope for Egyptian aid did not arrive, and Nebuchadnezzar did, to burn the houses of all the great men, and take a large part of the population into what became known as the Babylonian captivity. Here on the Ishtar Gate, you can see the symbol of Adad, the bull. Sometimes Adad is called the weather god. Even though the Babylonian captivity was a political disaster, the period produced some of the most important literature in the Old Testament. Jeremiah and Lamentations, Ezekiel, the so-called Second Isaiah, were all written at this time, and Daniel, though written later, was inspired by this period. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel is, in fact, probably the best-known story connected with the captivity. The dragon on the Ishtar Gate is the symbol of Marduk, usually called the Babylonian supreme being. The prophet Daniel says that when Nebuchadnezzar appointed the Hebrew Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to positions of authority, they nevertheless refused to worship the images of his gods, like this glorified lizard, which infuriated him. He said that unless they would bow down before his gods, he would throw them into a furnace, and not just any furnace, but one heated 7 times hotter than usual. Well, they still refused in a memorable way, saying that their God would protect them. But even if he wouldn't, they still weren't going to worship his silly Babylonian idols. Jeremiah criticizes his people for being stubborn and stiff-necked. But the kind of stubbornness displayed by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was obviously necessary if their faith was to survive. The Lord, of course, did protect them, and this so impressed Nebuchadnezzar that he not only left them alone, but ordered that anyone who bothered their people should be cut in small pieces. This is the symbol of Ishtar, the lion. Another thing that helped the Jews get through this was the fact that they blamed themselves for what had happened. Jerusalem hath sinned, therefore is she cast out, says Jeremiah. This is a relatively rare attitude today, when almost anyone who gets in any kind of mess has someone or something social, psychological, political, parental, or astrological other than himself to blame it on. But the more we blame others for our circumstances, the more we become sort of like helpless drones with no capacity to do either right or wrong, and with consequently no human dignity either. The Hebrews in captivity felt that what had happened to them was punishment for their wrongdoing. So the other side of the coin was, do right and the Lord will help you. They'd gotten themselves into the mess, it followed that they could then get themselves out of it. It should be said, however, that Job and Ecclesiastes make it clear that at least some of the Hebrews had come to accept the fact that they couldn't always count on God operating according to their standards of justice. Things didn't always balance out in life on earth. This, of course, was to give the Christians an opportunity to step in and say, yes, but there's another place where they do balance out. Here you see more of the ruins of Babylon. And then in 539, Cyrus the Great and his Persians attacked Babylon, snuck in through the sewers when the Euphrates was low, and overthrew Nebuchadnezzar's son Nabopolassar, also known as Belshazzar, for whom Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall, "Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting." As was so common in the history of Mesopotamia, a civilization and an empire that had looked indestructible was laid low after just a generation. This Cyrus is one of the real superstars of the ancient world, although Durant calls him an attractive ghost because so little is really known about him. Certainly the Old Testament Hebrews regarded him as highly as they ever regarded one not of their own faith. The prophet known as 2nd Isaiah calls him the Messiah, the Anointed, the Lord's Shepherd. This is all because he allowed the Hebrews to return to Jerusalem.
The British Museum has the so-called Cyrus cylinder, which has traditionally been interpreted as confirming that they were allowed to return home, and it does mention allowing various captive people to return to their homes, though the Jews aren't specifically mentioned. The text also praises Cyrus for what is viewed by some as his advocacy of what are now called human rights in general.
The return was not established without much wrangling and difficulty, however, and relations with Persia remained touchy until Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire altogether. This was followed by the rule of the Seleucids, relatives of Alexander the Great's general Seleucus. Seleucid rule was overthrown by the Maccabees, among the foremost of Hebrew heroes, but they eventually became clients of Rome. Revolt against Rome in Nero's day led to the destruction of the Hebrew state as a political entity until it was reestablished in 1948. Cyrus and his Persians were Indo-Europeans. That is, they spoke a language related to other Indo-European languages like Latin and Greek and most modern European languages, but also like Sanskrit. The usual view is that the original speakers of Indo-European lived maybe in the neighborhood of the Caspian Sea, and that the language in its various forms spread in all directions from there. There are, in any case, thousands of cognates in languages like Sanskrit and Latin that make their connection undeniable. Pitar is the Sanskrit word for father, pater is the Latin one, Dios is the Sanskrit word for sky, so Dios Pitar is the sky father, who is Jupiter in Latin. Agni is the Vedic fire god. Ignis is the Latin word for fire, whence our words like ignition, ignite. Brater is Sanskrit for brother, which is frater in Latin. Aryan is a synonym for Indo-European and is the source of the modern name for Persia, Iran. Hitler's use of the term led it to be associated with race, but from a philological point of view, anyone who can understand what I'm saying is an Aryan, whether he's from Europe, Africa, or China. Cyrus built a capital, the ruins of which you can see here at Pasargadae, where he had defeated the Medes on his way to consolidating Persia under his control. It was to remain sort of the spiritual center of Persia, even after Darius built Persepolis, which we'll see later. Cyrus was a follower of Zoroaster. Zoroaster was a real person who lived around 600 BC, and wrote the Zend-Avesta, the Bible, as it were, of Zoroastrianism.
At least
Two things in Zoroastrianism are thought to have had an influence on both late Hebrew and early Christian thought. For one thing, there is a clear contrast between a good god, Ahura Mazda, and a bad one, Ahriman. Satan, whose function in the Judeo-Christian tradition is similar to Ahriman's, does not play a prominent role in the Old Testament, and it is generally argued that what references there are to him there are mostly relatively late interpolations. He begins to play a more prominent role in the New Testament period, and by the Middle Ages, of course, was a real celebrity. It's arguable that to some extent the influence Zoroastrianism had on the Romans, which is undeniable, led to Satan's increased importance in the Christian world. This is a fire altar, the most typical sort of Zoroastrian religious architecture, and one of the few surviving from ancient Persian times. Ahura Mazda was identified with light, the sun, fire, things like that, and Ahriman with the dark side. The second thing in Zoroastrianism that is especially important with regard to the future of Christianity is the role of Mithras,
whose place in Zoroastrian theology is still argued about, but at least by Roman times he was
thought able to provide resurrection and passage to another life for those who followed the lifestyle and rules prescribed. The worship of Mithras in the Roman Empire was an even greater threat to Christianity than the worship of Isis, which promised a similar sort of rebirth from an Egyptian perspective. This is the tomb of Cyrus now at Pasargadae, more impressive than any tomb in Mesopotamia, but hardly in the same class with Egyptian funerary architecture. I say that Mithras and Isis were threats to Christianity, but in a way they can also be seen as preparing the way for its success, accustoming people to the odd notion that life on earth is not as important as the life to come, and that spiritual success is more important than worldly success. It's no accident that the Christians picked December 25th as the day on which to celebrate the birth of Jesus. It was the very day on which the followers of Mithras had celebrated his birth for centuries, associating it with the winter solstice and the rebirth, as it were, of the sun and its life-giving power. By 530, Cyrus had extended his conquests all the way to the Aegean. Herodotus tells a famous story of how Croesus, the famously rich king of Lydia in west-central Asia Minor, sent to ask the oracle at Delphi whether or not he should attempt to resist Cyrus. The oracle told him that if he fought Cyrus, he would destroy a great army. Well, that was just what he wanted to hear, so he immediately mobilized and set off to fight the Persians. But things didn't turn out the way he expected. His army was routed and he had to run for his life. Confused and angry, he sent another message to Delphi to ask for a clarification about this, and the messenger was told that the pronouncement of the oracle had been clarity itself. He had destroyed a great army. It's just that the army he destroyed was his and not Cyrus's. By the time Cyrus died in 530, there was serious friction developing in the Aegean as the Persians and Greeks encountered one another, and we're going to backtrack now to bring the Greek world up to this point. The usual view is that Greek civilization began with Minoan Crete, Minoan civilization that developed on the island of Crete, named after Minos, the legendary king of Crete. There are problems with this, however. For one thing, the people on Crete at this time didn't speak Greek, although remember, King Arthur didn't speak English either, at least not English as we know it. And for another thing, virtually nothing the people of Minoan civilization did in the arts had any influence on later Greek civilization. Be that as it may, Crete is certainly geographically part of the Greek world, and some of the most important Greek myths have their settings here, which helps justify starting with it. Also, it is interesting that the oldest things found on Crete, which we can call at all easily works of art, are pots. And the later mainland Greeks, especially in Attica, are going to become famous for their ceramic work. This was made at about the time the Great Pyramid was going up in Egypt in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. It's a far cry from a pyramid, but it's a nice gravy boat. This style of pot is called Kamares ware, after the name of a cave on Mount Ida on Crete, where many examples were found. By the time this was made, there was a legitimate civilization flourishing at Knossos, the most important city of the Minoan world, about 1700 BC. It has always looked a little to me as though this might have been made by some Australian aborigine, although at the same time there's a kind of electric abstract modernity about it that might appeal to collectors of 20th century art. And by the time this fine vase was made, around 1500 BC, Minoan civilization was at its height. Well, if you can read this, send me a letter, because no one else can. This is a tablet inscribed in Linear A, the language of Minoan civilization. Arthur Evans found many inscribed tablets during his excavations on Crete, but made no progress toward deciphering them. He apparently didn't even realize that he was collecting tablets that were in fact inscribed in not only Linear A, but in another different language now called Linear B. The Linear B tablets, about which more later, turned out to be early Greek. I said no one can read Linear A, but read can be a pretty vague term. I can understand English, but I can make little sense out of medical reports, the City of Oakland building permit regulations, or what my stockbroker says. Conversely, those who study languages can pick up certain clues about meaning even when the details aren't clear. For example, even if you don't read Latin, if you run across a sentence with the words Caesar and Cleopatra and Roma in it, you could probably guess that something's being said about Caesar and Cleopatra and Rome. Most of the surviving Linear A texts are thought to be the work of bureaucrats rather than poets. Minoan civilization seems to have left no literature in the narrow sense. In 1900, Arthur Evans bought the property where he thought the buried ruins of Knossos were and began excavating, eventually uncovering most of the palace complex we see in this aerial photo. He's been accused almost from the beginning of excessively restoring the buildings. Evans Knossos has been called an archaeological theme park, the Disneyland of the Mediterranean, concrete Crete, things like that. Here you see what's called the South House, and you get an idea of his work of rebuilding, without which, however, there would be nothing but ground plans here. Recently, as of 1999, his work has inspired new controversy since it has become apparent that some of his own restorations are in need of restoring, shoring up, repair. Should this be used as an opportunity to just restore the site to a more pristine state, or should a de facto stamp of approval be put on Evans' work by having it repaired? From what I hear, the mood is for restoring the restorations, which it is generally acknowledged are probably not wildly misleading in any case. This is the north gate into the palace complex as Evans restored it. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that does connect Crete with later Greek civilization is the series of myths associated with King Minos, Ariadne, Theseus, Daedalus, and others. These myths were often used as sources for literary and artistic subject matter, for everything from drama to vase paintings, and have inspired much later work as well, including Racine's Phèdre, considered by many to be the greatest French drama, and Strauss's Ariadne off Naxos. The story goes that King Minos' son, Androgeos, went off to participate in the Athenian Games, and did so well, winning every contest he entered and so on, that the Athenians killed him. And in revenge, Minos demanded that King Aegeus of Athens send 7 young men and women every year to be sacrificed to his pet monster, the Minotaur. This is called the throne room at Knossos for one very good reason. It has what looks like a throne in it, which we'll see in just a minute. It is, however, so small, I mean, I've been in houses that have bigger closets than this, that it's hard to picture it as a center of royal business and ceremony. To return to the story, though, finally King Aegeus' son Theseus vowed to go himself as one of the would-be victims and kill the Minotaur to put an end to this sacrifice. Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, fell in love with him and smuggled him a sword and a ball of string to help him in his fight with the Minotaur. The Minotaur was kept in the labyrinth, and Theseus would be able to find his way out of this maze by unrolling the string behind him and then winding it up again after he'd killed the monster. This is a 6th century vase depicting the climax of the story. Theseus was, of course, successful and then ran off with Ariadne, though he soon abandoned her and went on to have many other adventures. He's one of the heroes who goes with Jason and the Argonauts, and he defeated the Amazons and had a son by their queen. He had all kinds of trouble with Phaedra, Ariadne's sister, whom he eventually married. He helped the Lapids fight the centaurs and so on. We'll hear more about black-figured vase painting later. This is an example of the style you see here. It's essentially the style of the 6th century BC in Greece, and its subjects are drawn almost entirely from mythology. Here's an artist's view of what this part of the palace was like in antiquity, but this so-called throne room still looks so unpretentious, as I mentioned earlier, that it is difficult to believe it ever really functioned in the way one would expect of a throne room. The Minotaur itself was the natural child of Minos' wife, the ditzy Pasiphae. Everyone knew the story of how Minos was the son of Zeus and Europa, to whom he had appeared as a handsome white bull, and one day Pasiphae was out in the pasture and saw another handsome bull, which she immediately concluded was Zeus who had come for her because she was the most beautiful girl around now. She even had Daedalus, the architect of the palace and sort of the Leonardo of his day, design a kind of cow costume for her to wear by way of making herself all the more attractive to the bull. It's hard to picture what this was like, but it worked. The bull was attracted, only it wasn't Zeus. It was a real bull. The result of this encounter, then, was the birth of the Minotaur, half man and half bull. Here you see the interior of the throne room with what must have been the most uncomfortable throne any monarch ever sat upon. You should hold the griffins painted on the walls in your mind's eye a while, because I'll refer back to them in a bit. Their presence may indicate that a queen rather than a king sat on the throne, because they were apparently associated with female divinities like Cybele, aka the mother goddess, aka Rhea, and so on. It's surprising that Minos doesn't seem to have wondered more at the birth of the Minotaur. Of course, fathers are notoriously slow to acknowledge the homeliness of their children, but eventually he did agree perforce to have him locked up in the supposedly impenetrable labyrinth designed by Daedalus.
This is a model of more or less what the palace looked like, and it does look pretty labyrinthine.
Apparently the word labyrinth comes from the word labrys, the word for the double-bladed axe used in bull sacrifices here. So this was then the place of the labrys, the double axe, and because it was so complex, to be like it was to be labyrinthine, i.e. like the place of the labrys. I guess that makes sense. Minos was naturally angry about what happened to the Minotaur, so he locked Daedalus, whom he blamed for not making the labyrinth labyrinthine enough, and his son Icarus up in this very prison they had built. They escaped, however, by making themselves wings from candle wax and bird feathers. Icarus, however, flew too close to the sun. The wax melted and he fell into the sea. Olympic Airways, the Greek national airline, puts the names of gods and goddesses on its airplanes. You can fly on the Apollo or the Achilles and so on, but they haven't had the nerve to name one for Icarus. No one would want to get on that plane. This, in fact, is what's called a light well in the palace complex. The Palace of Minos is in many ways such a strange thing that some don't think it was a palace at all. Many of the rooms are small and more reminiscent of a tenement than a palace, and it's been pointed out that there's also no kitchen. But think of Versailles. Even as high-ranking a nobleman as the Duc de Saint-Simon thought he was lucky to have a room with a window at Versailles, and many had to make do with quarters that were hardly larger than a broom closet. And of course Versailles has no kitchen either. All the food was catered from the nearby town. So I don't think the look of this on the whole is really strong evidence against the claim that it was a palace. A fellow named Hans-Georg Wunderlich has argued that in fact the so-called palace was actually a mortuary, and that decor like this, which would at first glance seem appropriate for a queen's room, and this is called the Queen's Room or Queen's Megaron at Knossos, is in fact funerary in significance. Wunderlich thinks that dolphins, the color blue, and rosettes are all things associated with death and burial. I'm not so sure about dolphins in the color blue, but it is true that rosettes, especially blue ones, are often used to decorate things like sarcophagi. This looks like a bathtub at Knossos, but Wunderlich says that's a sarcophagus if I ever saw one. A few years ago, the author of a National Geographic article about Knossos suggested, apparently with Wunderlich's view in mind, that this might be a kind of combination bathtub and sarcophagus. It probably was a bathtub, though it may have been a sarcophagus. I don't think it was both. These, which have always been taken for storage jars, Wunderlich thinks were actually sarcophagi also. It is true that the Greeks later did bury their dead in such pottery sarcophagi, but no trace of a body has ever been found in any of these at Knossos. The main problem with Wunderlich's thesis is just that it is so counterintuitive that it would need a ton of evidence to establish it convincingly. And it's not taken seriously by many professional scholars. Far from thinking it a mortuary, Michael Wood has called it one of the most livable palaces ever built. This is called the South Propylon, and you can see some restored paintings here. In fact, all the paintings one sees now at Knossos are either essentially repaintings, as in the throne room, or copies of fragmentary original decorations which have been removed to the Heraklion Museum. I mentioned earlier that the throne might actually have been used by a queen rather than a king, and it is sometimes argued that the architecture and decoration of the palace have a distinctly feminine quality. It's not fortified, for example, and there are few references to the usual macho activities like war and hunting. It may be, whether or not this was a queendom instead of a kingdom, that it was thought unnecessary to fortify it because the Minoan fleet could protect the island from invasion. But what the absence of warfare and hunting in the decoration here implies, it's hard to say. There isn't much of that sort of thing surviving at Mycenae either, and it's always considered to have been a very masculine sort of place. Here you can see the paintings of the South Propylon up closer. Men do appear much more often than women in Minoan art, but they are very elegant men, more like the Egyptian ideal than the Assyrian, say. Here's one of the original paintings on which those copies are based. The term fresco is sometimes used to designate any sort of wall painting, but these were apparently done in true or buon fresco. That is, in essence, the colors were painted on plaster when it was wet. Arthur Evans identified this fellow on the basis pretty much of intuition alone as a priest king. Priest is probably more likely than king, but even that's a pretty speculative conclusion given the evidence. Apropos of Minoan religion in general, it seems odd that there is so little about the palace and its decoration that seems specifically religious in purpose. There is, at least, no large shrine or temple, and unless we're missing their significance, few of the surviving paintings seem to be any more spiritual than ordinary decorative genre art.
This is the famous Bull Leaper fresco from Knossos, now in the Heraklion Museum.
The figures at either side are lighter in color and seem to have breasts, but they really do not look much different in figure than the supposed men who are carrying the vases in the pictures we just saw. In any case, whether men or women, and I do think the lighter color alone makes them very likely women, they seem to be assisting a third who is apparently vaulting over the back of the bull. Some, Professor John Chadwick for example, think that what seems to be represented here is impossible, but it's important to keep in mind that this was painted on the wall of the royal palace. One could certainly argue that if commemorating bull leaping accomplishment is the goal here, then you certainly don't want some ordinary, everyday, easy episode represented. You want the thing depicted the way it was done at its very best. The way the Muhammad Ali of bull jumping floated like a butterfly right over old man Stomper's back. Considering the apparent importance of the bull in Minoan religion also, it may well be that this sort of thing was looked upon as entertainment for the gods, a kind of offering in the form of a performance. This would be a kind of foreshadowing of the Olympic Games, which were themselves thought of as, first of all, entertainment for gods and only secondarily as a spectator sport for mortals.
Numerous other examples of this kind of thing have also been found, including this example from Avaris in the Nile Delta, and modern versions of it can be found in the south of France and elsewhere, I imagine, by now.
Okay, that's where we'll take the intermission.